Welcome to Revenge Oath. Tonight we are uncovering a case where a small bell rang twice in the dead of night, once to summon help and once to signal murder. Holmes soon learns the second toll was no accident. Your comments mean the world. Tell me where you're watching from today. Now, let's follow Holmes into the mystery. Sherlock Holmes and the little bell that tolled twice. It was upon a morning of singular stillness, when the fog lay so heavily upon Baker Street that even the gas lamps seemed to burn in reluctant whispers, that the little bell first made itself known to us. I say made itself known, for at the time neither Mr. Sherlock Holmes nor I suspected that its sound so slight, so easily dismissed, would come to toll twice, nor that the second toll would ring with fatal consequence. I was seated at the small escritoire by the window of our lodgings at No. 221B, attempting with limited success to bring order to my notes from a recent case, while Holmes reclined upon the sofa in an attitude of profound abstraction. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half-lidded, fixed upon a point somewhere beyond the ceiling, where only his remarkable mind could wander. The room bore the familiar signs of his restlessness. A violin lay abandoned upon a chair, its strings yet vibrating faintly from some unfinished experiment in sound. The Persian slipper upon the mantelpiece overflowed with tobacco, and the chemical table by the wall bore the scars of recent and not altogether harmless inquiry. It was then that the bell sounded, not the sharp peal of our own doorbell, whose clangor had so often heralded clients in distress, but a far subtler note, a thin, metallic chime, distant and uncertain, as though carried by the fog itself. It came once, faint yet distinct, and then was swallowed again by the silence of the street. I paused in my writing. "Did you hear that, Holmes?" I asked. "Most assuredly," he replied without altering his posture. "A handbell. Brass, I should say. Small, likely rung by a cord rather than struck directly." I confess I stared at him. "You amaze me. I could scarcely tell what it was at all." "Which is precisely why it interests me," he returned. "Sounds that go unnoticed often bear the greatest significance." I rose and crossed to the window, peering down into the murk below. Baker Street lay muffled and spectral, its outlines softened into vague suggestion. A hansom cab crept past like a phantom beetle, its wheels making no sound upon the damp stones. No bell was to be seen, nor any hand that might have rung it. "Some street vendor, perhaps," I ventured, "or a servant summoning a porter." Holmes gave a short, humorless laugh. "My dear Watson, you persist in seeking comfort in the ordinary. If it were so, you would not still be thinking of it." Before I could reply, the bell sounded again, clearer this time, closer, and unmistakably deliberate. Two measured chimes, evenly spaced, followed by a pause of such expectancy that I felt an absurd impulse to hold my breath. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. He crossed to the window with a fluidity of motion that spoke of long practice, drew aside the curtain by no more than an inch, and looked out. "Curious," he murmured. "What do you see?" "Nothing and everything." The bell was rung from directly across the street. Yet there is no one there now. At that moment, a sharp knock sounded at our door, brisk and official in its character. "Mrs." Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, whose anxious expression and hurried manner announced at once that the morning's calm had been irrevocably disturbed. "Mr. Holmes," he began, scarcely waiting for introductions. "I was hoping to find you in. There's been an incident, a most perplexing one, and I don't hesitate to say we're at a loss." Holmes turned from the window, his eyes alight with a sudden and keen interest. "Pray proceed, Inspector. But first, did you hear a bell ringing in Baker Street some few minutes ago?" Lestrade blinked. "A bell? No, I can't say that I did." "Of course not," Holmes replied softly. "Do continue." The inspector cleared his throat. "It concerns Sir Alastair Pembroke of Pembroke House, Bloomsbury. You may recall him Member of Parliament, considerable fortune, no known enemies to speak of." "I recall the name," said Holmes. "A man excessively punctual, if memory serves, and intolerant of inefficiency. Lestrade nodded. That's the one. Well, this morning at precisely 7 o'clock, Sir Alistair was found dead in his private study. Locked room, Mr. Holmes. Door bolted from the inside, windows fastened, servants sworn to their routines. No sign of struggle, no weapon to be found. And the cause of death? I asked. That's just it, Lestrade replied. The doctor says heart failure, but there are circumstances that don't sit right. Sir Alistair was in excellent health. Moreover, there's an object found at the scene that none of us can account for. Holmes' eyebrows rose a fraction. Indeed? A little handbell, said Lestrade, lying on the desk beside him. Brass, no more than 3 inches high. The servants insist it wasn't there the night before. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, a glance heavy with unspoken meaning. Was the bell rung? Lestrade shifted his weight. That's the oddest part. The housemaid on the floor below claims she heard it ring twice at precisely 6:30. She thought nothing of it at the time. Sir Alistair was fond of his routines, you see. But when he did not emerge at 7 as usual, they broke into the study and found him dead. A silence settled upon the room, dense as the fog outside. Holmes returned slowly to the sofa and seated himself, his fingers once more steepled, his gaze now inward rather than aloft. A bell rung twice, he murmured. Once unheard, once remembered. You'll take the case, then? Lestrade asked eagerly. I don't mind admitting, Holmes, that the Yard could use your insight. The newspapers are already sharpening their knives. Holmes smiled faintly, though there was no mirth in it. My dear Inspector, the case has already taken me. The only question is how far it intends to lead us. He rose, reached for his coat, and turned to me. Come, Watson. I believe a little bell has rung for us as well, and it would be the height of discourtesy not to answer it. As we stepped out into the fog-bound street, I could not rid myself of the uneasy conviction that we were already too late, or perhaps, more disturbingly, precisely on time. The fog thickened as we made our way eastward, clinging to the wheels of the cab and curling about the lamps like some living thing reluctant to release its grip upon the city. Holmes sat opposite me in silence, his long frame rigid, his eyes fixed upon the shifting grey beyond the window. I had learned by long experience that such stillness marked not idleness but intense activity of mind, and I refrained from interrupting him until he spoke at last, without turning his head. You observe, Watson, he said, that Inspector Lestrade heard no bell. I do, I replied. Yet the housemaid did, and we ourselves heard one in Baker Street. I fail to see the connection. Failing to see is not the same as there being nothing to see, Holmes returned mildly. What interests me is not merely that the bell was heard, but who heard it, where, and why. Before I could frame a response, the cab slowed and drew up before an imposing Georgian facade set back from the street by a short iron fence. Pembroke House loomed out of the fog with an air of austere respectability, its tall windows dark and unwelcoming, as though the very bricks had withdrawn into themselves after the morning's events. Lestrade was waiting for us at the gate, his hat pulled low and his expression strained. He greeted Holmes with evident relief and ushered us inside without delay. The hall was spacious and sparely furnished, every object arranged with a precision that spoke eloquently of its late master's habits. Even in death, Sir Alistair Pembroke's insistence upon order seemed to pervade his surroundings. You see, Lestrade said, gesturing about him as we removed our coats, everything in its place. No sign of intrusion. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he bent to examine the umbrella stand by the door, lifting one of the canes with a gloved hand and turning it slowly. Your housemaid is left-handed, he remarked. Lestrade stared. How the devil? The wear upon the handle, Holmes replied, setting the cane back precisely as he had found it. More pronounced upon the right side, suggesting it is grasped by the left hand when lifted. A small thing, perhaps, but it tells us that your witness is observant enough to notice a sound she would not ordinarily hear, or else inclined to imagine one she expected. You think she imagined the bell? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. I think nothing yet, Watson. I merely collect possibilities and allow them to jostle until one remains standing. We were led up the broad staircase to the first floor, where the study lay at the rear of the house. The door stood open now, though Lestrade assured us it had been forced only after Sir Alistair failed to emerge at his customary hour. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his gaze sweeping the room in a single comprehensive glance. It was a large chamber, lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, their contents arranged with almost military precision. A heavy desk of dark mahogany stood near the window, upon which were laid several papers, a pen, and most conspicuously a small brass handbell. Sir Alistair's body had been removed, but the impression of his presence lingered still, as though the room itself had not yet accepted his absence. Holmes crossed at once to the desk and stood over the bell without touching it. For a long moment he regarded it in silence. "May I?" Lestrade asked, reaching toward it. "If you please," Holmes replied, stepping aside. The inspector lifted the bell and gave it a tentative shake. It emitted a clear, delicate chime, precisely the sound we had heard that morning. "Unremarkable enough," Lestrade said. "Yet none of the servants recognize it." "And Sir Alistair did not employ bells in his study?" Holmes asked. "Never," Lestrade replied. "He was a man who disliked interruptions. He rang only for his valet, and that by means of an electric buzzer installed in his bedchamber." Holmes nodded, his eyes still fixed upon the bell. And yet this one was rung twice. He moved then about the room with that peculiar, half-absent air which always accompanied his examinations. He knelt to inspect the carpet, ran a finger lightly along the window latch, peered into the fireplace, and examined the papers upon the desk without disturbing their order. I followed as best I could, recording his observations in my mind, though their significance largely escaped me. At last he straightened and turned to Lestrade. "You say the room was locked from the inside. How was it secured?" "A bolt," Lestrade replied, indicating the heavy iron fixture upon the door. "Thrown from within. We found it fast when we arrived." "And the windows?" "Fastened. No sign of tampering." Holmes walked to the window and looked down into the garden below. The fog had thinned somewhat, revealing a small, neatly kept lawn bordered by bare winter shrubs. "No footprints?" he asked. "None that weren't accounted for," said Lestrade. "The gardener had been at work yesterday afternoon." Holmes turned back into the room, his expression thoughtful. "A man in excellent health, found dead in a locked room, with no sign of violence, and an unfamiliar object at his side. The cause of death attributed to the heart, yet doubted by those present. And a bell rung twice, once before death, once after, or perhaps twice before. Tell me, Inspector, at what precise time was Sir Alistair last seen alive?" Lestrade consulted his notes. "By his valet, at 10 o'clock the previous evening. Sir Alistair dismissed him and retired to his study, as was his custom, to read before bed." "And no one saw him thereafter?" "No one." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we may provisionally place the time of death between 10 o'clock and 6:30. "Which gives us a window of 8.5 hours, I said. "A broad one. Broad enough to conceal a multitude of sins." Holmes agreed. "But not, I think, this particular one." He turned once more to the bell and, at last, lifted it gently. Holding it up to the light, he examined the rim, the handle, the tiny clapper within. "Watson," he said suddenly, "what do you make of this?" I took the bell from him and inspected it as carefully as I could. "It appears ordinary enough," I admitted, "though well made, possibly older than the rest of the furnishings." "Just so," Holmes said. "And yet," he took it back and set it down again, precisely where it had been. Lestrade frowned. "That much is obvious." "Is it?" Holmes asked quietly. "Obvious things are often the most deceptive. Tell me, Inspector, have you ascertained the bell's origin?" "We've made inquiries," Lestrade replied. Several shops in the city sell similar items, but none can place this particular one. There are no maker's marks. Holmes smiled, a thin, knowing smile that sent a faint chill down my spine. Then we must look elsewhere for its provenance. A bell, after all, is not merely an object. It is an instrument designed to summon, to warn, or to mark the passage of time. And which did this one do? I asked. Holmes met my gaze. That, my dear Watson, is precisely the question. And until we answer it, the room remains very much locked. Holmes remained standing by the desk for some moments after his last remark, his gaze drifting from the bell to the scattered papers and thence to the empty chair where Sir Alistair Pembroke had met his end. There was in his expression that peculiar mingling of detachment and intensity which I had come to recognize as the prelude to some decisive mental advance, though he gave no outward sign of it. "At what hour was the body examined by the physician?" he asked at length. "Shortly after 8, Lestrade replied. Dr. Havisham was summoned at once. He pronounced life extinct and attributed the death to sudden cardiac failure. "And yet you are dissatisfied," Holmes said. Lestrade hesitated. "I won't deny it. Havisham's competent enough, but he admitted the heart showed no obvious disease, no prior complaints, no warning signs. Sir Alistair was known to walk daily and prided himself on his constitution." Holmes nodded. "A natural death is often the most convenient disguise for an unnatural one. Did the doctor remark upon the expression of the deceased?" Lestrade's brow furrowed. "He did, as a matter of fact," said Sir Alistair, looked surprised. Not distressed exactly, but as if something had caught him unawares. "Ah," said Holmes softly. "Surprise is a most revealing emotion. One cannot feign it in death." "Do." He moved to the chair and rested a hand upon its back. "Sir Alistair was seated here when he died." "Yes," slumped forward, according to the valet. Holmes adjusted the chair by a fraction of an inch, then sat down briefly, only to rise again almost at once. "The papers on the desk, were they disturbed?" he asked. "No, everything as you see it." Holmes scanned them quickly. Correspondence of a routine nature. Parliamentary notes. Nothing contentious, nothing personal. No letter demanding payment or threatening exposure. "Which suggests," I ventured, "that the cause of his death lay not in what he read, but in what he heard or believed he heard." Holmes turned and regarded me with approval. "An excellent observation, Watson. You grow more dangerous by the day." Lestrade shifted impatiently. "Then you believe the bell killed him?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that the bell played its part. Whether as cause or catalyst remains to be seen." He rose and began pacing the room slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Consider the circumstances. A man alone, at night, engaged in quiet reading. The house is still. Then a bell rings once, perhaps, to attract attention, twice, to confirm intent. The sound is unexpected. It does not belong to this room, nor to any known habit of the household. It suggests a summons, but from whom? And you think he rang it himself?" Lestrade asked skeptically. Holmes stopped and looked at him. "On the contrary, I think it was rung for him." A silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel. "But there was no one here," Lestrade protested. "No intruder, no accomplice." "No visible one," Holmes corrected. "Which is not the same thing." He moved to the fireplace and examined the cold ashes within. "No fire last night." "No," said Lestrade. "Sir Alistair preferred the room cool." "Then the bell's sound would carry all the more clearly," Holmes murmured. "No crackle of flames to mask it." He straightened and turned abruptly. "Inspector, I should like to speak with the housemaid who heard the bell." Lestrade nodded and stepped to the door, returning shortly with a young woman who curtsied nervously and kept her eyes fixed upon the floor. Holmes addressed her gently, in a tone far removed from his usual brusqueness. "You were awake at 6:30 this morning?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied. I was dusting the landing below, as I do every morning. And you heard a bell? Yes, sir. 2 rings, clear as anything. From where did the sound seem to come? She hesitated.
From above, sir. From Sir Alister's rooms.
Holmes inclined his head. Had you ever heard such a bell before? No, sir, never. And yet you did not investigate. She flushed. It weren't my place, sir. Sir Alister didn't like to be disturbed. Quite so, Holmes said. And after the bell rang, did you hear anything else? She thought for a moment. No, sir. Only the bell. Not even footsteps. No, sir. Holmes dismissed her with a kind word and stood silent until the door closed behind her. Then he turned to us, his eyes bright. Observe, he said, that the bell was heard only by those who were awake and attentive. Lestrade heard nothing, nor, I imagine, did any of the other servants, who were abed. The sound was not loud, but precise. It was meant for a single listener. You mean Sir Alister, I said. Precisely. Lestrade shook his head. But why? What could a bell do that a voice could not? Holmes smiled thinly. A voice reveals the speaker. A bell does not. It announces presence without identity. It is the sound of expectation. He returned to the desk and picked up the bell once more, this time placing it carefully into his pocket. I trust you will forgive the liberty, Inspector, he said. I shall require this. Lestrade opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it. Very well, but I hope you'll tell me what you find. In good time, Holmes replied. For now, I should like to examine the rest of the house, particularly any rooms adjoining this one. We spent the next hour moving through Pembroke House under Holmes's quiet direction. He examined the corridor outside the study, the neighboring bedchamber, the servants' staircase, and even the garden below the window, though nothing immediately noteworthy presented itself. Yet I could see that Holmes' mind was working steadily, fitting each observation into some invisible framework. At last, as we stood once more in the hall below, Holmes paused by the door and bent to examine the threshold. Inspector, he said, you remarked that there was no sign of intrusion. That's correct. And yet, Holmes continued, straightening, there is no sign of departure either. Lestrade frowned. What do you mean? If an intruder had entered and left, however subtly, there would be some trace, however slight, of passage. A scuff, a displaced grain of dust, a footprint, out of season. There is nothing, which suggests that whoever or whatever summoned Sir Alister did not need to enter at all. I felt a chill at his words. You speak as though the bell itself were the intruder. Holmes met my gaze. Not the bell, Watson, but what it represented. He turned to Lestrade. I shall need a list of Sir Alister's recent visitors and correspondence. And I should like to know whether any similar bells have been reported elsewhere, however trivial the circumstance. Lestrade looked skeptical but nodded. I'll see what I can do. As we stepped back out into the fog, Holmes drew a deep breath, as though invigorated by the chill air. The case advances, he said quietly. Toward what? I asked. He glanced at me, a rare gravity in his expression. Toward a truth that has been carefully muffled, Watson. And like that bell, it will sound faint at first until it rings again. We returned to Baker Street in thoughtful silence, the fog now lifting in ragged wisps, as though London itself were reluctant to relinquish its secrets. Holmes walked with his head bent, the bell heavy in his pocket, his pace measured and unhurried. I knew better than to press him while his mind was thus engaged, yet my curiosity grew with every step. It was not until we had settled once more in our sitting room, with the familiar comfort of its disorder about us, that he spoke again. He placed the bell carefully upon the table between us, where it caught the light of the window and gleamed with an innocent brightness wholly at odds with the grim purpose it had served. Watson, he said, what is the first assumption made in cases of sudden death? That the death is natural, I replied. And the second? That if it is not natural, it must be violent. Holmes nodded. Just so. Poison, blunt force, strangulation, these are the usual suspects. But there exists a subtler class of crimes which rely not upon physical injury, but upon knowledge. Knowledge of habit, of temperament, of fear. He picked up the bell and rang it softly. The sound was delicate, almost pleasant, and yet I felt again that faint tightening of the nerves which had accompanied its first toll. Imagine, Holmes continued, a man of rigid routine and strong will, a man who prides himself on order, on the mastery of his surroundings. Such men are often ill-equipped to deal with the unexpected. Introduce into their carefully regulated world a single anomaly. Small, unexplained, persistent, and you may produce effects far out of proportion to the cause. You suggest, I said slowly, that Sir Alistair was frightened. I suggest, Holmes corrected, that he was startled into a condition his heart could not withstand. But startled by what? I pressed. A bell alone seems a slender instrument of murder. Holmes smiled. Alone, yes. But paired with anticipation, there lies its potency. He crossed to the mantel and took down a monograph on acoustics, leafing through it absently. Tell me, Watson, have you ever experienced the sensation of expecting a sound and finding that the expectation itself becomes oppressive? I cannot say that I have. Then you are fortunate, Holmes replied. There are men for whom anticipation is agony, particularly when it is cultivated over time. He closed the book and turned back to me. Sir Alistair Pembroke was not a man without enemies. On the contrary, his career furnished him with a great many, though none, perhaps, of the obvious sort. He was known for his opposition to certain charitable reforms, was he not? Yes, I said. He spoke against the expansion of public relief on several occasions. And in doing so, Holmes continued, he made himself unpopular among a particular class of reformers, earnest, intelligent men and women who believe profoundly in their cause. You do not mean to suggest? I suggest nothing yet, Holmes said sharply. I merely observe that ideology can be as sharp a weapon as any dagger, if wielded with sufficient precision. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade, whose expression bore the marks of both haste and excitement. I've got something for you, Holmes, he said, producing a folded sheet of paper. A list of Sir Alistair's recent visitors and correspondence, as you requested, and more besides. Holmes took the paper and scanned it rapidly. Go on. There's been another report, Lestrade continued. Not a death this time, but an incident. A man in Bloomsbury heard a bell ringing outside his study window late last night. Said it rang twice, just as in Pembroke House. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Who is this man? Don. Mr. Edwin Harcourt, Lestrade replied. A barrister, known associate of Sir Alistair's. They disagreed publicly over a bill last month. Did anything happen to him? No, said Lestrade. He opened the window, looked out, saw nothing, and thought no more of it until he read of Sir Alistair's death this morning. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. And Mr. Harcourt's health? Not good, Lestrade admitted. A weak heart, by his own account. A fortunate thing for him, then, Holmes murmured, that he did not die of surprise. He rose abruptly. Inspector, I should like to speak with Mr. Harcourt at once. Lestrade hesitated. He's shaken. I'm not sure. All the more reason, Holmes said. Fear is freshest at its source. Within the hour, we were seated in Mr. Harcourt's drawing room, a modest but well-appointed space that bore signs of recent disturbance. The man himself was pale and visibly agitated, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. I tell you, Mr. Holmes, he said. I heard it as plainly as I hear your voice now. 2 rings, soft but deliberate. And you saw no one? Holmes asked. No one. The street was empty. Holmes nodded. Did the sound trouble you? Harcourt hesitated. I cannot say why, but yes, It set my nerves on edge. I slept poorly thereafter. Where? Had you received any communications recently that might have predisposed you to such unease? Holmes asked. Harcourt frowned. There was a letter. Anonymous. Consequences of what? I asked. Harcourt swallowed. Of my opposition to certain reforms. It accused me of callousness, of indifference to suffering. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. And Sir Alister received similar letters? I believe so, Harcourt said. He mentioned them in passing. Thought them the work of cranks. Holmes' lips tightened. Cranks, Mr. Harcourt, are often dismissed too readily. May I see the letter? Harcourt produced it from a drawer. Holmes read it carefully, his expression unreadable. Thank you, he said at last. One final question. When you heard the bell, did you feel as though it were meant for you? Harcourt shuddered. Yes. Holmes rose. That will be all. As we left the house, I could contain myself no longer. You think the bell is a warning, I said. A threat. A summons, Holmes corrected. A reminder that one has been marked. And Sir Alister? He was the first, Holmes said quietly. But not, I fear, the last, unless we act swiftly. He quickened his pace, his earlier calm replaced by a restless energy that I had learned to associate with imminent revelation. Watson, he said, we are dealing not with a single crime, but with a campaign. One that relies upon precision, patience, and an intimate understanding of human frailty. And the bell? I asked. Holmes's eyes were dark. Is merely the signal. The true weapon is expectation. As the fog closed in once more around us, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, not far away, another little bell was waiting to be rung. Holmes did not return at once to Baker Street after our interview with Harcourt. Instead, he hailed a cab and directed the driver toward the Strand, settling back with an air of quiet resolve that told me his thoughts had taken a more definite shape. We are not yet ready to hunt the bell-ringer, he said, as though in answer to my unspoken question. First, we must understand the audience for whom the bell was rung. The cab deposited us near the offices of the Morning Chronicle, where Holmes led me inside without explanation. The editor, a florid gentleman with ink-stained cuffs, greeted Holmes with the wary cordiality of a man accustomed to being both helped and embarrassed by him. A list, if you please, Holmes said without preamble. The names of those who have recently written letters to your paper on the subject of public relief, particularly those expressing moral outrage. The editor blinked. That's a tall order, Mr. Holmes. Not so tall as the gallows, Holmes replied mildly, and considerably less uncomfortable. Within minutes, we were seated at a side table, poring over a sheaf of correspondence. Holmes skimmed rapidly, discarding most with a flick of his fingers, until at last he paused and extracted 3 letters, laying them side by side. Observe, he said, tapping them in turn, the similarity of tone. Passionate, articulate, indignant, but not incoherent. These are not the ravings of the unbalanced. They are composed with care. I read them closely. Each denounced the opposition of certain MPs and barristers to expanded relief programs, accusing them of cruelty disguised as prudence. None was signed, but all bore the same sharp, elegant hand. You think these were written by the same person? I said. I am certain of it, Holmes replied. And I am equally certain that the writer did not intend these letters merely for publication. Then why send them at all? To establish a record, Holmes said. To place the grievances in plain sight, so that when consequences followed, they could be framed as inevitable. And he gathered the letters and stood. Come, Watson, there is another stop to be made. Our next destination was far less public, a narrow street near Lincoln's Inn, where a modest building bore the discreet sign of a philanthropic society devoted to urban improvement. Holmes paused across the way, observing the entrance with interest. Here, he said, is where our misdirection lies. You believe the culprit is connected with this society? I asked. I believe, Holmes said carefully, that someone wishes us to believe so. We watched as men and women came and went, earnest-faced and plainly dressed. There was nothing furtive in their manner, nothing to suggest conspiracy, and yet Holmes's gaze lingered upon them with an intensity that made me uneasy. Inspector Lestrade will look here next, Holmes continued. Anonymous letters, political disagreement, moral fervor, it fits neatly into a familiar narrative. Too neatly. You think it is a false trail? An attractive one, Holmes said, and therefore suspect. We returned to Baker Street as evening fell, the lamps glowing softly through the dusk. Holmes was uncharacteristically restless, pacing the room and pausing now and then to consult his notes, only to discard them again. The bell, he murmured at last, stopping before the table where it lay. Why a bell, Watson? Why not a knock, or a note, or a spoken word? To avoid being seen, I suggested. Yes, but also to avoid being traced, Holmes replied. A bell leaves no voice, no accent, no words to be recalled. Only sound. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands. And yet sound, too, has its peculiarities. He rang it softly, then again, listening intently. Do you hear it? It sounds the same as before. Holmes smiled faintly. Does it? Listen more closely. He rang it a third time, holding it nearer to the table. The sound seemed subtly altered, duller somehow. The surface beneath it matters, he said. Wood, stone, air, all shape the resonance. This bell has been rung on more than one surface. I stared at him. You mean that it was tested, Holmes said. Practiced. The ringer was careful, methodical. There was a sudden knock at the door, sharp and urgent. Lestrade entered at once, his face grave. There's been another death, he said. This afternoon, a Mr. Lawrence Whitby, civil servant, collapsed in his study not an hour ago. Holmes's eyes flashed. And a bell? Lestrade nodded. Found on his desk, identical to the one from Pembroke House. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Time? Holmes asked. 4:30, Lestrade replied. Servant heard a bell shortly before. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as though in acknowledgement of a grim confirmation. Then the pattern accelerates. What do you make of Whitby? Lestrade asked. Any connection to the others? He supported Pembroke, I said slowly, the realization dawning. Voted with him. Spoke against the same reforms. Holmes opened his eyes. Just so. And yet, he broke off, turning suddenly toward the window. Watson, tell me what time did Mr. Harcourt hear his bell? Late last night, I said. After midnight. And Whitby? Holmes asked Lestrade. Early afternoon. And Pembroke? Holmes continued. 6:30 in the morning. He nodded to himself. Different hours, different locations, but always when the victim was alone and at ease. Lestrade looked troubled. Then we're dealing with a madman. Holmes shook his head. No, Inspector. A madman would strike wildly. This is controlled, deliberate. The bell is rung when its effect will be greatest. And Harcourt? I asked. Why was he spared? Holmes's gaze flicked to me. Was he? I felt a chill. You think he's still in danger? I think, Holmes said, that Harcourt's weak heart was known. The bell was rung as a test. When death did not follow, the ringer adjusted his expectations. Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. Then, how do we stop him? Holmes replaced the bell upon the table with care, by making him ring it where he cannot escape the sound of his own logic. He turned to me. Watson, there is a flaw in the pattern, one so small that it might easily be overlooked. The bell has rung twice for each victim. Yes, I said, that was noted from the beginning. Indeed, Holmes replied, but not where it rang. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. In Pembroke House, The bell was heard below the study. In Whitby's case, the servant heard it from the corridor. In Harcourt's, it came from outside the window. And the significance? Holmes smiled thinly. The bell is never rung in the same place twice, which means the ringer moves but always within a very particular radius. I stared at him. You know where he stands. I know where he must stand, Holmes corrected. And more importantly, where he cannot. Lestrade straightened. You've got him, haven't you? Holmes did not answer at once. He merely reached for his coat. I have a suspect, he said at last. But suspicion is not proof. Tonight, Inspector, we shall give our bell ringer an audience and see whether he dares to perform once more. As we stepped into the gathering night, the echo of that delicate chime seemed to follow us still, faint yet insistent, promising that before the dawn, it would toll again. Holmes's plan, as he revealed it to Lestrade once we were safely ensconced in a cab, was characteristic in its blend of audacity and restraint. He spoke quietly, with the air of a man setting pieces upon a chessboard whose endgame he could already perceive, though others saw only confusion. Our bell ringer, he said, is not improvising. He follows a principle. That principle can be turned against him. Lestrade leaned forward. You said you knew where he must stand. What did you mean by that? I meant, Holmes replied, that the bell is rung from a position that is both proximate and concealed, close enough to be unmistakable, distant enough to avoid detection. In Pembroke House, the sound traveled downward, in Whitby's laterally, in Harcourt's inward from the street. In each case, the bell was rung from a space adjacent to, but not within the victim's room. A corridor, a stairwell, a garden, I said. Or a shared wall, Holmes added. A narrow margin, Watson. Narrow enough to be exploited. The cab drew up before a quiet terrace in Kensington, where a row of respectable houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their rear gardens abutting one another in a patchwork of hedges and low walls. Holmes paid the driver and stepped out, his eyes already scanning the architecture with keen interest. This, he said, is where we wait. Lestrade frowned. For whom? For the next bell, Holmes replied. We were admitted to the house by its owner, a nervous but cooperative gentleman whose name Holmes had produced with remarkable promptness. He was, it seemed, another public figure who had recently opposed the same reforms as Pembroke and Whitby, and who, by unhappy coincidence, lived adjacent to a narrow service passage shared with the neighboring property. He's not been threatened, Lestrade whispered as we were shown into the rear parlor. No letters. No warnings. Then he is either overlooked, Holmes said, or reserved. We took up our positions as dusk settled into night. Holmes stationed himself near the back door, where a small window overlooked the passage beyond. Lestrade and I waited in the shadowed parlor, the air heavy with anticipation. The house was quiet, its occupant upstairs, unaware of the danger or the protection below. Minutes stretched into an hour. I began to fear that Holmes's calculation had erred, when at last a faint sound reached my ears, the soft scrape of a footstep, cautious and measured. Holmes stiffened. He raised a hand, signaling silence. Through the window, I saw a shadow pass along the wall outside, no more than a darker blur against the night. Then came the sound, a delicate chime, scarcely louder than a whisper, yet unmistakable. Once, a pause. Twice. In that instant, Holmes sprang into motion. He flung open the back door and darted into the passage, his long stride carrying him forward with astonishing speed. Lestrade and I followed hard upon his heels, the narrow space echoing with our pursuit. Ahead of us, a figure turned and fled, slipping through a side gate into the adjoining garden. Holmes vaulted the low fence with cat-like agility, landing lightly upon the damp grass beyond. The figure stumbled, recovered, and ran again, but Lestrade was upon him now, grappling fiercely. They went down together, and in moments the man was secured, his coat torn, his hat lost in the struggle. Holmes bent over him, breathing hard, his eyes alight with triumph. "Good evening," he said calmly. The man looked up, his face pale but composed. He was of middle height, neatly dressed, with an air of cultivated intelligence that struck me at once. There was no wildness in his eyes, only a cold, weary resolve. "You are too late," he said quietly. "The bell has already sounded." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and you have already failed." Lestrade hauled the man to his feet. "Name," he demanded. The man hesitated only a moment. "Julian Mercer." Holmes nodded. "Secretary to the Urban Renewal League. Author of several unsigned letters to the Morning Chronicle. Amateur acoustician." Mercer smiled faintly. "You have done your homework." "Only what was necessary," Holmes said. "You believed yourself invisible, Mr. Mercer, because you never entered the room. You rang from the margins, exploiting architecture and habit alike. You counted on the frailty of your victims, and on the assumption that death by fright would be mistaken for death by nature." "And was I wrong?" Mercer asked. Holmes's expression hardened. "In one respect, yes. You underestimated the variability of fear." Mercer laughed softly. "Pembroke deserved what he got. Whitby, too. Men who condemned thousands to suffering with the stroke of a pen. I merely hastened the inevitable." "And Harcourt?" I asked. Mercer's gaze flicked to me. He was next. Lestrade tightened his grip. "You're confessing, then?" "I am explaining," Mercer replied. "There is a difference." Holmes stepped closer. "There is also a flaw in your logic. You believe that fear could be calibrated like a chemical dose. That 2 rings of a bell, delivered under the right conditions, would produce a predictable result." Mercer's smile faded. "But fear," Holmes continued, "is not uniform. It depends upon expectation, upon imagination, upon guilt." He gestured toward the house behind us. "The man within has received no letters, no warnings. He has nothing to fear yet. Your bell would have startled him, perhaps disturbed his sleep, but it would not have killed him." Mercer's eyes widened slightly. "You rang too soon," Holmes said softly. "Which is why we were here." For a long moment, Mercer said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged, and with them the last of his composure. "I wanted them to hear it," he said hoarsely, "to know that something was coming, that their choices had consequences." "And now," Holmes replied, "you will face yours." Lestrade signaled to the waiting constables, who emerged from the shadows to take Mercer into custody. As they led him away, I could not help but feel a curious mixture of relief and unease. The danger had been real. The method, chilling in its simplicity. We returned to Baker Street in the small hours of the morning. Holmes was unusually quiet, his earlier intensity giving way to a contemplative calm. He removed his coat and set the bell once more upon the table, regarding it with a thoughtful eye. "A clever man," I said at last, "and a dangerous one." "Yes," Holmes agreed. "Clever enough to forget that intelligence without restraint is merely another form of brutality." He picked up the bell and rang it once, then set it down again. "The sound itself is innocent," he said. "It is what men choose to attach to it that gives it power." As I prepared for bed, I reflected upon the strange path the case had taken from a faint chime in the fog to the exposure of a mind warped by conviction and cunning. The bell had tolled twice for its victims, but now, at last, it was silent. Yet, as I extinguished the lamp, I could not help but wonder how many other small, overlooked sounds in the world might carry within them the seeds of catastrophe, waiting only for the right ear and the right fear to bring them to deadly fruition. Sleep did not come readily to me that night. Though the bell lay silent upon the table and its author was secured behind iron bars, my thoughts returned again and again to Holmes's final words. The innocence of sound, the malignancy of meaning. It was therefore with some surprise that I found Holmes already awake and dressed when I descended the following morning, his mood altered from the gravity of the night before to one of alert expectancy. "You are early," I remarked. Late, rather, he replied. The mind that rests too soon after exertion risks overlooking its own omissions. He was seated at the table, a sheaf of papers spread before him. The bell was absent. You have returned it to the yard? I asked. No, Holmes said. I have loaned it. I raised an eyebrow. Loaned it? To Mr. Julian Mercer's rooms, Holmes replied. With Inspector Lestrade's permission, naturally. I wish to observe something. What could possibly remain to observe? I asked. Mercer confessed. The pattern is clear. Holmes smiled faintly. Confessions are among the least reliable forms of evidence, Watson. Men confess to what they believe you wish to hear. I prefer to confirm what they do not realize they have revealed. At that moment, a knock sounded at the door, and Lestrade himself entered, looking both tired and faintly irritated. You might have warned me, he said, casting a glance toward the empty spot upon the table. I assumed you would approve, Holmes replied calmly. After all, the bell was never the weapon, only the messenger. Lestrade sighed. Mercer's solicitor was most put out. But I'll admit, I'm curious. What did you learn? What did you learn? Holmes rose and paced the room slowly. That Mr. Mercer was not acting alone. Lestrade stiffened. That's a serious claim. And a necessary one, Holmes returned. Mercer was intelligent, disciplined, and ideologically driven, but he lacked one crucial quality. What's that? I asked. Patience, Holmes replied. The sort of patience required to test, refine, and perfect a method over months. Mercer believed himself the architect of this scheme. In truth, he was its most devoted disciple. Lestrade frowned. You think someone put him up to it? I think, Holmes said, that someone taught him. He gestured toward the papers on the table. Mercer's rooms were orderly to the point of obsession. His books arranged by subject, his notes cross-referenced, his instruments meticulously labeled. Yet, there were inconsistencies, gaps in his research that suggested prior instruction. Instruction in what? Lestrade demanded. In the psychology of fear, Holmes replied. Specifically, in the exploitation of anticipatory stress. I leaned forward. You mean someone showed him that fright could kill? More than that, Holmes said. Someone demonstrated it. Lestrade's expression darkened. You're suggesting an earlier case. Another victim. Or a near victim, Holmes said. One who survived and whose experience was recorded. He reached for a small notebook and flipped it open. Do you recall, Watson? A case from some 3 years ago, a minor affair, scarcely reported. A retired naval officer found collapsed in his study, revived by his wife, who claimed he had been startled by a sudden noise. I searched my memory. Vaguely. I recall you dismissing it at the time as inconclusive. Because it was, Holmes said. But it was also instructive. Lestrade crossed his arms. You think that was a test run? I think it was a lesson, Holmes replied, and Mercer was the pupil. There was a brief silence, during which the implications settled heavily upon us. Then where does that leave us? Lestrade asked at last. If Mercer wasn't the originator, then the originator remains at liberty. Holmes finished. And worse, remains unrecognized. Lestrade cursed softly. You should have told me this sooner. Holmes's gaze was steady. I wish to be certain. No. And are you? I asked. Holmes nodded. I am now. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded scrap of paper. This was found among Mercer's effects. A quotation, copied out in a different hand than the rest of his notes. He handed it to me. I read aloud, Fear is not born of danger, but of expectation. It's elegant, I said, and chilling. It is also not Mercer's, Holmes replied. I recognized it at once. From where? Lestrade asked. From a lecture, Holmes said, delivered some years ago at King's College by a man who has since made a modest reputation for himself as a lecturer on moral philosophy and social responsibility. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. You have a name. I have a name, Holmes agreed, and a motive, more subtle than Mercer's rage. Why hasn't he acted himself? I asked. Because he is careful, Holmes said. Because he understands that influence is safest when exerted at a remove. Mercer believed he was striking blows for justice. In truth, he was proving a thesis. Lestrade straightened. Then we move now. Holmes shook his head. Not yet. We require proof, not of Mercer's actions, but of the mind that shaped them. And how do you propose to get it? Lestrade asked. Holmes smiled. That familiar, dangerous smile, by ringing the bell once more. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves seated in the lecture hall of King's College, the air thick with the murmur of anticipation. The lecturer, a tall, composed man with iron-grey hair and an assured manner, spoke eloquently of ethical obligation and the weight of collective responsibility. His words were measured, his arguments persuasive. Holmes listened intently, his eyes never leaving the man's face. As the lecture concluded and applause filled the hall, Holmes leaned toward me. "Observe," he murmured. "No surprise, no uncertainty. He is entirely at ease." "And that proves?" I began. Holmes rose. "That he has nothing to fear, which is precisely why he will." He moved swiftly down the aisle, and before I could grasp his intention, he rang the bell once, twice clear and deliberate. The sound cut through the applause like a knife. The lecturer froze. For a fraction of a second, no more than a heartbeat, his composure shattered. His eyes widened, his breath caught, and his hand flew instinctively to the lectern for support. Then, with visible effort, he mastered himself. The hall fell silent. Holmes stood calmly, the bell lowered at his side. "That," he said softly, "is the sound of recognition." The lecturer stared at him, color draining from his face. "I believe," Holmes continued, "that you know this bell, sir. You have heard it before, though never rung by your own hand." The silence deepened, charged and terrible. And in that moment, I knew the case was not yet finished, but that its final revelation had already begun to toll. For several heartbeats, no one moved. The audience, uncertain whether they had witnessed some planned demonstration or a breach of decorum, sat frozen in a collective hush. The lecturer's hand still gripped the edge of the lectern, the knuckles white against the polished wood. His eyes had not left Holmes. Then, with an effort that was almost audible, he smiled. "You will forgive me," he said, his voice carefully steady. "But I do not recognize you, sir. Nor do I see the relevance of a bell to the subject of my address." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Holmes inclined his head politely. "Of course," he replied. "Recognition is not always conscious. Indeed, it is often the body that remembers first." He turned slightly, so that his words carried to the front rows without rising above a conversational tone. "You spoke just now of moral responsibility, of the duty to act when one perceives injustice. A noble theme. But tell me, Professor, does that duty extend to experimentation upon the fears of others?" The lecturer's smile stiffened. "I have no idea what you are implying." Holmes stepped closer to the dais. "Then allow me to clarify. Some years ago, you delivered a private seminar on anticipatory stress on the physiological effects of prolonged expectation. You proposed, did you not, that under certain conditions, fear alone might prove fatal?" The color returned to the lecturer's face, this time in a flush. "That was a theoretical discussion," he said sharply. "Purely academic." "So you claimed," Holmes replied. "Yet theory has a way of seeking proof." There was a stir near the back of the hall as Inspector Lestrade emerged from the shadows, his presence unmistakable. Several members of the audience gasped. Others leaned forward eagerly, sensing drama where they had expected philosophy. "You will come with us, Professor," Lestrade said firmly. There are questions you need to answer. The lecturer, Professor Adrian Kell, laughed softly, though the sound rang hollow. On what charge, Inspector? Disturbing the peace of a lecture hall? Holmes answered for him. On the charge of orchestrating a series of murders while keeping your own hands clean. An audible shock passed through the room. Kell's composure faltered for the first time. He glanced about him, as though seeking allies among the rows of attentive faces. This is absurd, he said. You have no evidence. Holmes raised the bell. On the contrary, I have this and what it signifies to you. Kell's gaze fixed upon the bell, and for a fleeting instant, the careful mask slipped. It was gone almost at once, but Holmes had seen it, and so had I. Remove him, Lestrade said to the constables now advancing. Kell straightened, smoothing his jacket with deliberate care. Very well, he said. I will answer your questions. But I assure you, this will not end as neatly as you imagine. The hall erupted into confused conversation as Kell was escorted away. Holmes did not look back. He merely slipped the bell into his pocket and gestured for me to follow. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted across the courtyard, gilding the stone with a deceptive warmth. Lestrade approached, his expression a mixture of triumph and concern. You took a risk in there, he said. If he'd held his nerve. He did hold his nerve, Holmes replied. And if he denies everything? Lestrade pressed. Then he will be forced to explain a great many things, Holmes said calmly. Including his correspondence with Mercer, his unpublished notes on experimental stress, and his presence quite coincidental, I'm sure near the residences of our victims on the nights in question. Lestrade whistled softly. You've been busy. Necessity is an excellent motivator, Holmes said. That evening, Kell was questioned at length. I was not present for the entire interrogation, but Holmes later recounted it to me with characteristic precision. Kell denied direct involvement in the deaths, of course. He admitted to intellectual discussions with Mercer, to sharing his theories, to encouraging rigorous thinking, but stopped short of acknowledging intent. I never told him to kill, Kell insisted. You told him how fear works, Holmes replied. You told him how expectation amplifies sensation, how the mind can be made to do the body's work. You gave him the key and let him open the door. Kell was silent then. The decisive moment came when Holmes produced Mercer's notebook and placed it before him. Opened to a page filled with careful annotations in Kell's own hand. You corrected his assumptions, Holmes said. Refined his method. You even suggested the use of a neutral stimulus, a bell, precisely because it carried no inherent threat. That was your contribution, Professor. The bell that tolled twice. Kell's shoulders sagged. I wanted to prove a point, he said quietly. That moral complacency kills as surely as any weapon. That society's indifference has a cost. And so you manufactured one, Holmes replied. Measured in human lives. Kell was charged as an accessory to murder, his academic reputation collapsing with startling speed once the details emerged. Mercer, confronted with Kell's involvement, withdrew his earlier defiance and confessed fully, his sense of righteous isolation shattered by the knowledge that he had been used. The case concluded not with a dramatic trial, for that lay yet ahead, but with a heavy silence that seemed to settle over London itself. The newspapers, which had once sharpened their knives for scandal, now blunted them in cautious editorials about responsibility and the dangers of fanaticism cloaked in intellect. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fire, the bell once more upon the mantel. He regarded it for a long time without speaking. You were right, I said at last. The sound itself was innocent. Yes, Holmes replied, but innocence is easily conscripted. He picked up the bell and turned it in his fingers. Kell believed that ideas absolved him of action. Mercer believed that action absolved him of guilt. Between them, they constructed a philosophy that excused murder. And you? I asked. What do you believe? Holmes smiled faintly. I believe that understanding carries obligation. To know how a thing may be done is not the same as having the right to do it. He set the bell down gently. This case will not be remembered for its method, Watson, but for its warning that the most dangerous crimes are not always those committed in passion or greed, but those committed in the name of reason. As I later wrote these notes, I found myself listening more closely to the sounds of the city, the distant bells, the footsteps in the street, the ordinary noises of life. Each seemed newly charged with possibility. The little bell had tolled twice, and in doing so had revealed not only a murderer, but a far more unsettling truth. That fear, once taught, can outlive its teacher and ring on in the minds of others long after the sound itself has faded. In the days that followed Professor Kell's arrest, London seemed to exhale slowly, cautiously, as though uncertain that the danger had truly passed. The fog returned in its familiar fashion, cloaking streets and consciences alike, and the city resumed its accustomed rhythms. Yet beneath that surface calm, the reverberations of the case continued to spread. Holmes followed the proceedings with a detached interest, scanning the newspapers each morning and setting them aside with a brief snort of satisfaction or irritation, according to the accuracy of their accounts. Mercer's confession, once full and unguarded, had left little room for doubt as to his actions, though he clung stubbornly to the belief that he had served a greater good. Kell, by contrast, maintained a studied ambiguity, admitting intellectual influence while denying moral culpability. "It is the last refuge of the abstract mind," Holmes remarked one morning as he folded the Times. "When confronted with consequence, it retreats into theory." "You believe he will be convicted?" I asked. Holmes shrugged. "That is a question for the courts. I concern myself only with whether the truth has been sufficiently illuminated." Despite his words, I sensed that the case still occupied his thoughts. He was restless again, pacing the sitting room, pausing to stare out at Baker Street, or reaching absently for his violin, only to set it aside untouched. The bell remained upon the mantelpiece, conspicuous in its silence. It was on the fourth evening after Kell's arrest that Lestrade paid us another visit. He looked worn, but relieved, as though the burden of the affair were at last lifting from his shoulders. "Kell broke today," he announced without preamble. "Not completely, but enough." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Do tell." "Do." "He admitted to selecting the initial subjects," Lestrade said. "Pembroke first. He called it a necessary demonstration, claimed he never intended Mercer to take it so far. And yet he did nothing to stop him," Holmes observed. "Quite," Lestrade agreed. "Kell says he thought Mercer would frighten them, shame them, perhaps. He never expected death." Holmes's lips thinned. "No man ever expects the full weight of his ideas until they fall upon flesh." Lestrade nodded. "There's more. Kell kept records, notes of discussions, drafts of lectures never delivered. We found references to several other names, Harcourt among them." I felt a chill. Then Harcourt was still in danger. "He was," Lestrade confirmed. "We've placed protection on him. Discreetly. He's shaken, but alive and very grateful." Holmes allowed himself a small nod. "Then the pattern is complete." "Almost," Lestrade said. "There's one thing that bothers me. Kell insists the bell was Mercer's idea, not his." Holmes smiled faintly. "Naturally, he does. You don't believe him?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that ideas rarely belong entirely to one man. But the bell, its symbolism, its restraint that bears Kell's signature. Mercer lacked the patience for such elegance until he was taught it." Lestrade rose to take his leave. "Well, Holmes, however it shakes out." Holmes waved a dismissive hand. "You owe me nothing, Inspector. Only remember this case the next time an intellectual crime presents itself." When the door had closed behind him, Holmes turned to the fire and stood gazing into it, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said after a moment, "this case reminds me uncomfortably of another." "Which one?" I asked. "The Musgrave ritual," he replied. "Not in circumstance, but in consequence. A puzzle pursued for its own sake until the human cost becomes undeniable. You don't regret taking it on? I asked. Regret, Holmes echoed. No, but I am reminded that reason, like any instrument, may be misused. One must be vigilant even against one's own methods. That night, Holmes surprised me by asking for my opinion. Watson, he said, do you believe fear can ever be justified as a tool? I considered carefully before answering. Fear may warn. It may prevent harm. But when deliberately cultivated, it becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. Fear may alert the conscience, but it should never be made to replace it. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mr. Edwin Harcourt arrived at Baker Street, pale but resolute, his manner marked by a seriousness that bespoke recent introspection. I wished to thank you, he said to Holmes, and to apologize. For what? Holmes asked. For dismissing the warnings, Harcourt replied. For believing that words could not harm me. Holmes regarded him steadily. Words rarely kill on their own, Mr. Harcourt. It is what we do or fail to do after hearing them that proves decisive. Words. Harcourt hesitated. The bell still troubles me, he admitted. Even now I find myself listening for it. That, Holmes said gently, is the true residue of this affair. But take comfort. Once fear is named, it loses much of its power. After Harcourt departed, Holmes took the bell from the mantel and wrapped it carefully in a cloth. What will you do with it? I asked. Remove it from circulation, Holmes replied. Objects acquire histories. Better that this one fade into obscurity. Later that afternoon, as we walked along the embankment, the bells of Street Clement Danes rang out across the river, full and resonant in the clear air. I glanced at Holmes, half expecting some reaction, but he walked on unperturbed. Do they trouble you? I asked. No, he said. Those bells speak to all. They summon without menace. He paused and looked out over the Thames, its surface glinting beneath the pale sun. It is the private signal that unsettles the sound, meant for one mind alone. As the weeks passed, the case receded into memory, though not into insignificance. The trial, when it came, was conducted with due solemnity. Mercer was convicted swiftly. Kell's judgment followed after longer deliberation, the court wrestling with the boundaries between influence and intent. When the verdicts were delivered, Holmes merely nodded, as though confirming a calculation long since completed. On the evening the matter was finally concluded, Holmes stood once more by the window of our sitting room, the city spread before him in light and shadow. The bell has rung its last, I said quietly. Holmes did not turn. Perhaps, but its echo remains. He faced me then, his expression composed, almost serene. Come, Watson. There will be other cases, louder crimes, bloodier puzzles. But I suspect this one will linger longer in the mind. And why is that? I asked. Because it reminds us, Holmes replied, that the most dangerous conspiracies do not shout. They whisper, they wait, and they depend upon the assumption that no one is listening. As the gas lamps flickered on below, I resolved to record the case with particular care, not merely as a chronicle of detection, but as a caution. For though the little bell that tolled twice had been silenced, the lesson it carried was one the world could ill afford to forget. Though the legal machinery ground on toward its inevitable conclusions, Holmes's interest in the affair diminished rapidly once the essential truth had been exposed. This was ever his way. The capture of the culprit satisfied only a portion of his intellect. It was the illumination of cause and consequence that truly engaged him. Once that light had been cast, he turned away without regret. For my own part, I found that the case lingered in subtler fashion. I caught myself pausing at unexpected sounds, the distant clatter of hooves, the faint chiming of a shop bell as a customer entered, each noise momentarily freighted with memory. Holmes alone seemed immune, moving through the city with his customary indifference, as though the bell had never rung at all. It was on a quiet evening, some weeks after the verdicts had been delivered, that the matter found its true conclusion. We were seated together after dinner, Holmes engaged in one of his chemical experiments, while I read by the fire. Outside, Baker Street lay calm, the fog held at bay by a rare clarity of air. The hour was late, and the world seemed content to let us be. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly without looking up, "do you recall the very first sound that drew us into this affair?" "The bell," I replied at once. "Here in Baker Street." "Just so," he said, "and yet that bell was not rung by Mercer, nor by Kell." I lowered my book. "What do you mean?" Holmes set aside his apparatus and turned toward me, his expression thoughtful rather than grave. "The bell you and I heard that morning was not the same instrument found beside Pembroke. Similar in tone, perhaps, but not identical." I stared at him. "You never mentioned this." "Because it did not alter the outcome," Holmes replied, "and because its significance lies not in the crime, but in what followed." "You mean—" "I mean that someone else rang a bell in Baker Street that morning," Holmes said calmly. "Someone entirely unconnected with the case. A street porter, perhaps. A tradesman. An accident of circumstance. And yet," I said slowly, "it was that sound which set everything in motion." Holmes smiled. "Precisely." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "It is a useful reminder, Watson, that meaning is rarely intrinsic. We impose it. That first bell possessed no malice, no design. But to us, armed with subsequent knowledge, it became charged with portent." "You're suggesting," I said, "that we too were influenced by expectation." "As are all investigators," Holmes replied. "The difference lies in recognizing it." He rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where the space once occupied by the bell now stood empty. Had we been less attentive, we might have dismissed that initial sound. Had we been more fanciful, we might have constructed an entirely different narrative around it. "And which would have been worse?" I asked. Holmes considered. "Both. To ignore evidence is folly. To overvalue it is superstition." He turned to me, his eyes keen but not unkind. "The art of detection lies in distinguishing signal from noise without mistaking one for the other." There was a brief silence, companionable and reflective. At length, Holmes reached for his violin and drew the bow lightly across the strings, coaxing forth a low, thoughtful melody. "Do you think," I asked, "that Mercer ever realized he was being guided?" Holmes played on for a moment before answering. "At some level, perhaps. But belief is a powerful anesthetic. Mercer wished to see himself as the agent of justice. Kell provided him with a vocabulary that made that self-image possible." "And Kell?" I pressed. "Did he truly believe himself innocent?" Holmes's music faltered, then resumed. "I believe Kell convinced himself that ideas exist in a moral vacuum, that their consequences belong to others. It is a comfortable delusion, particularly for men who live by words." He set the violin aside. "But ideas, like bells, are meant to be heard. Once released, one cannot dictate who will listen or how." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, its familiar resonance filling the room. Holmes glanced at it and smiled faintly. "Time, at least, is honest in its tolling," he said. "It warns us all, without discrimination." As the evening drew on, our conversation drifted to other matters, old cases, half-remembered oddities, and the endless peculiarities of human behavior. Yet beneath it all, I sensed that Holmes regarded the affair of the little bell as a kind of intellectual punctuation, a pause, rather than a conclusion. In the days that followed, life at Baker Street resumed its accustomed pattern. Clients came and went, mysteries presented themselves in varied guises, some trivial, others grave. Holmes applied himself to them with undiminished vigor, though I detected in him a renewed attentiveness to motive and insistence upon understanding not merely what had been done, but why it had seemed necessary to the doer. One afternoon, as I was organizing my notes, I came upon the pages relating to the bell. I hesitated, pen poised, uncertain how best to frame the ending. "How shall I conclude it?" I asked Holmes. "With the arrest? The trial? The warning you spoke of?" Holmes glanced up from his work. "Conclude it as it truly ended," he said, with silence. "Silence?" I echoed. "Yes," Holmes replied. "The silence that follows understanding. The moment when the sound has ceased, but its lesson remains." I took his meaning then, and wrote accordingly. For it was not the bell itself that defined the case, nor even the deaths it precipitated, but the fragile boundary between influence and intent, the ease with which fear may be cultivated, and the difficulty of containing it once loosed. The bell had tolled twice, and with its second ringing had revealed a truth more unsettling than murder. That reason, when untempered by conscience, may become as lethal as any blade. On a final evening, as we sat together watching the lights of London flicker into being, Holmes spoke once more of the affair. "You know, Watson," he said, "there is a peculiar arrogance in believing one may frighten the world into virtue." "And what is the alternative?" I asked. He considered. "Understanding, patience, and the acceptance that moral change cannot be coerced without cost." He rose and extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into shadow. "Come, tomorrow will bring its own puzzles." As I retired for the night, the city lay quiet beyond our windows. No bell rang in Baker Street, no summons disturbed the calm. And yet, in that very absence of sound, I felt the quiet assurance that vigilance, once awakened, need not rely upon alarms. Thus ended the case of the little bell that tolled twice, not with a clangor of triumph, but with a measured silence, and a renewed respect for the delicate power of the unseen forces that shape human action. And in that silence, I found perhaps the truest testament to my friend's genius, that having heard the bell and traced its meaning, he was content to let it fade, knowing that wisdom, once earned, need not announce itself at all. Yet for all Holmes' insistence upon silence as the proper ending, life itself proved unwilling to leave matters entirely at rest. There are cases, I have observed, that conclude decisively, and others that merely settle like dust after a disturbance never quite returning to their former order. This was of the latter kind. Some nights later, when the memory of the bell had softened into something almost abstract, I was roused from my reading by the sound of Holmes's violin. It was not the sharp, experimental playing with which he often tested an idea, but a slow and contemplative air, drawn out with unusual restraint. The melody carried a reflective sadness that caused me to look up at him more closely. "You are revisiting it," I said. Holmes did not stop playing at once. Only when the phrase had resolved itself did he lower the bow and nod. "Yes," he admitted, "though not in the way you suppose." I waited, knowing better than to interrupt. "There is a temptation," he continued, "to imagine that once a scheme is uncovered, its danger is extinguished. That is rarely the case. Methods perish more slowly than men." "You fear imitation," I said. "I expect it," Holmes replied calmly. Kell's ideas were not confined to one mind. They were shared, debated, refined. Mercer was merely the first to act upon them with fatal earnestness. "And yet," I countered, "without the bell, without the precise circumstances." Holmes raised a finger. "The bell was incidental. The principle is portable." He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out upon Baker Street, where a solitary constable paced his beat below. "Fear as leverage, Watson. Anticipation as a weapon. These notions have an enduring appeal to those who mistake control for justice." I felt a stir of unease. "Then, what is to be done?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Nothing, and everything. One cannot prevent the misuse of ideas, only respond when they are misused. That is the detective's burden. The following morning brought a small but telling development. A letter arrived unsigned, postmarked Bloomsbury, its contents brief and restrained. The bell is silent. The lesson remains. I hear it still. I read it twice before handing it to Holmes. From whom? I asked. Holmes examined it with care, then shook his head. It could be from anyone who followed the case closely, or from no one of consequence at all. You don't think? No, Holmes said firmly. Mercer is secured. Kell is discredited and watched. This is not a threat. Then what is it? A confession of influence, Holmes replied. Someone has understood the idea and is troubled by it. He folded the letter and placed it in the fire, watching until the last trace of ink vanished. Better that such echoes be burned than answered. Days passed. Other cases intervened. A matter of forged antiquities, an insurance fraud of surprising subtlety, a domestic mystery resolved with little more than patience and tea. Yet from time to time, I caught Holmes pausing when a bell rang in the street, a shop bell, a church bell, the call of a passing vendor. He never started, never betrayed alarm. But there was a momentary stillness, as though he were measuring the sound against an internal scale. One evening, as we dined together, I ventured a final question. Holmes, I said, do you think the victims ever understood what was happening to them? He considered. Pembroke, I believe, sensed something amiss, an intrusion into the order of his world. Whitby, perhaps less so. Fear operates differently in each man. And Harcourt. Holmes allowed himself a rare softness of expression. Harcourt was spared the full realization. That may be mercy, or it may be a burden of another kind. You don't envy him? No, Holmes said. Awareness is always preferable to ignorance, however uncomfortable. Later that night, as we prepared for rest, I heard Holmes moving quietly about the sitting room. Curious, I rose and found him standing before the mantel, where a small empty space remained. You are thinking of the bell again, I said. I am thinking of absence, Holmes replied. Of what remains when the object is gone. He turned to me. Tell me, Watson, when you write this account, what will you emphasize? The ingenuity of the method, I said. The danger of ideas divorced from conscience. Holmes nodded. Good, but also make clear this, that no crime exists in isolation. Each draws upon the habits, expectations, and blind spots of its time. And ours? I asked. He smiled. Ours is an age that prizes intellect, efficiency, moral certainty, all admirable qualities until they become absolute. He extinguished the lamp and moved toward his bedroom door. That is why this case matters. Not because of how it was done, but because of how easily it could be repeated. The weeks turned into months, and at last, even the newspapers ceased their commentary. The name of Julian Mercer faded into obscurity. Professor Kell's lectures were quietly removed from curricula. His work cited with caution, or not at all. London, resilient as ever, absorbed the disturbance and went on. Yet for me, the sound of a bell would never again be quite neutral. Nor, I suspect, for Holmes, though he would never admit it. On a final afternoon of rare sunshine, we walked together along Regent's Canal, the air bright with reflected light. A distant church bell rang out, full and resonant. Holmes paused. That bell, he said, marks time. It belongs to everyone. And the other? I asked. The other, Holmes replied, belonged to no one, and that was its danger. He resumed walking, his stride easy, his mind already turning toward whatever puzzle might next demand his attention. As I set down these last lines, I am struck by a curious inversion. Most cases announce themselves with violence, with spectacle, with an unmistakable demand to be solved. This one began with almost nothing at all, a sound so slight it might have been ignored. That it was not ignored is due, as ever, to Holmes's peculiar genius. his refusal to dismiss the insignificant, his insistence that meaning often hides in the margins. The little bell that tolled twice did not merely summon its victims, it summoned attention to the peril of unexamined ideas and to the quiet power of expectation. And so I conclude this narrative, not with a flourish, but with an admonition. Listen carefully. The next time a sound seems out of place, it may be nothing. Or it may be the first echo of a truth that, once heard, cannot be unlearned. Time, which dulls so many impressions, seemed only to sharpen the memory of this affair. I found, as weeks passed, that the case of the little bell did not recede into the comfortable distance occupied by most of our adventures. Instead, it remained curiously present, less as a sequence of events than as a state of mind. Holmes, too, appeared conscious of this lingering effect, though he gave it no name. One evening, as autumn settled fully upon London and the streets glistened with recent rain, we sat together in our accustomed places. Holmes had been silent for some time, absorbed in a monograph on ancient signaling systems, when he closed the book with a decisive motion and leaned back. "Watson," he said, "do you know what distinguishes a solved case from a finished one?" "I had assumed they were the same," I replied. "Rarely," he said. "A case is solved when its mechanism is understood. It is finished only when its consequences have been absorbed." "And has this one been absorbed?" I asked. Holmes glanced toward the window, where the lamps of Baker Street burned steadily in the dusk. "By the law, perhaps. By the public. Eventually. By us. Soon. I hope." There was no regret in his tone, only a measured acceptance. He reached for his pipe, then set it aside unlit. "You see, Watson," he continued, "the danger in this affair did not lie solely with Mercer or Kell. They were symptoms. The true condition was a faith in inevitability, the belief that certain outcomes justify any means. And you fear that belief persists." "I know it does," Holmes replied. "It always has." I considered this in silence. "Then what comfort is there?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Understanding is a form of resistance. To name a thing is to limit its power." He rose and crossed the room, retrieving from a drawer a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the bell, or rather, one very like it. I looked at him sharply. "You said you had removed it from circulation." "So I did," Holmes replied. "That bell was melted down along with several others and recast." He rang it once. The sound was fuller, warmer, lacking the thin precision of the original. "This one," he said, "belongs to a parish school in Lambeth. It will ring at the start of lessons, nothing more." "You kept it as a reminder," I said. "As a correction," Holmes replied. "Sound is not the enemy. Intention is." He replaced the bell in its wrapping and set it aside. There is a tendency, after cases of this nature, to indulge in moral finality, to declare the lesson learned and the matter closed. That is vanity. "And yet," I said, "you do not seem troubled." Holmes returned to his chair. "Because trouble implies uncertainty. I have none. Men will continue to frighten one another in the name of improvement. Others will continue to resist. The balance shifts, but the forces remain." "You speak as though detection itself were a modest enterprise." "It is," Holmes said simply. "At its best, it restores proportion. It reminds us that no idea, however elegant, is exempt from scrutiny." The clock chimed softly. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels hissing on the wet stones. "You know," Holmes added, "Kell once wrote that fear is the most efficient catalyst for change." "And you?" I asked. "I would counter," Holmes said, "that fear accelerates decay far more reliably than growth." There was a knock at the door, an unremarkable interruption, and yet I felt a reflexive tightening that made me smile at myself. Holmes noticed it and raised an eyebrow. "You see," he said gently, "expectation lingers, But it need not govern. Mrs. Hudson entered with the evening post. Among the letters was one bearing a familiar hand, Inspector Lestrade's. Holmes read it quickly and handed it to me. It concerned a minor matter, a suspected theft resolved, a false alarm dismissed. Nothing of consequence. They manage well enough without us, I remarked. Occasionally. Holmes agreed. Which is as it should be. He stood and stretched, a rare sign of physical ease. Come, Watson, there is no virtue in brooding over completed work. Tomorrow will present its own enigmas, and I prefer to meet them unencumbered. Before retiring, I took one last look at the sitting room, the mantel bare, save for its usual ornaments. The fire reduced to embers, the shadows familiar and unthreatening. The bell, once so charged with menace, was now only a memory, its power dissipated by comprehension. As I write these final words, I am struck by how easily the extraordinary disguises itself as the trivial. A sound, a gesture, an idea uttered in passing. Any one of these may become dangerous if received by the wrong mind at the wrong moment. Holmes understood this instinctively, not as a source of fear, but as a call to attentiveness. He never spoke again of the little bell, and I did not ask him to. For in his way, he had already said everything of importance. He had traced the arc from sound to expectation, from expectation to fear, and from fear to fatal resolve, and in doing so, had restored the proper scale of things. The bell that tolled twice does not ring in Baker Street now. Its echo survives only in these pages, and in the quiet vigilance it inspired. If there is a moral to be drawn, it is not that one must fear subtle dangers, but that one must think clearly when confronted by them. Holmes, I know, would dismiss such reflections with a shrug and reach for his violin, or his chemicals, or the next problem that presented itself. Genius, in his case, lay not in grand pronouncements, but in the steady refusal to be misled by noise, by silence, or by the seductive certainty of unexamined ideas. And so I lay down my pen, content that this strange and troubling chapter has been faithfully recorded. The city sleeps. The bells that ring tonight do so openly, honestly, and for all to hear, which is precisely how it should be. It was some months later, when winter had yielded at last to a tentative spring, that I found the final piece of the matter settling into its proper place, not through any new crime or revelation, but by the quiet operation of hindsight. Holmes and I were seated together one evening, the windows open to admit the softened air, when the distant bells of Street Mary LeBeau drifted faintly across the rooftops. Holmes paused in the act of loading his pipe and listened. "There," he said mildly. "That is how a bell ought to sound." I smiled. "Without menace? Without exclusivity," he corrected. "It announces itself to all, and therefore threatens none." He resumed his task, and for a while we sat in companionable silence. At length, I ventured the question that had lingered in my mind since the close of the case. "Holmes," I said, "when you rang the bell in the lecture hall, did you know, with certainty, that Kell would betray himself?" He looked at me, amused. "Certainty is a luxury, Watson. I had a probability. And if he had not reacted, then I should have learned something equally valuable." Holmes replied. "That I had misjudged him, and would have adjusted accordingly." "You risked public embarrassment," I said. "I risked nothing of importance," Holmes returned. "The innocent are rarely undone by scrutiny. It is secrecy that trembles when the light is applied." I reflected upon this. Then the bell was never truly the key. "No," Holmes agreed. "The bell was merely a question. Kell's reaction was the answer." He leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Consider the elegance of it, Watson. Kell believed he had devised a method that insulated him from consequence. He influenced without acting, taught without instructing, observed without intervening. He mistook distance for innocence. That. And Mercer?" I asked. "A tragic corollary," Holmes said quietly. "A man who wanted certainty in a world that offered none. Kell gave him a framework that made murder feel inevitable rather than chosen." The bell, I said, made it feel impersonal. Just so, Holmes replied. It allowed Mercer to believe that he was not killing men merely ringing a signal and letting nature take its course. A comforting fiction. I shuddered slightly. And the victims? Holmes's expression softened. Pembroke lived by control and died when it was taken from him. Whitby lived by caution and failed to imagine danger without form. Harcourt survived because doubt his own made him alert. Then doubt saved him, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. Doubt is often the beginning of wisdom. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a cab passed, its driver calling to a late pedestrian. Life, indifferent to philosophy, went on. You know, Holmes continued, most crimes are solved when the culprit is found. This one was solved when the idea was exposed. And that is enough? I asked. Holmes met my gaze. It must be. He rose and crossed to the mantel. Where no bell stood now, only the familiar miscellany of our shared existence. I have said before, Watson, that detection is not about triumph. It is about restoration. In this case, what needed restoring was proportion. Between what and what? Between thought and action, Holmes replied. Between influence and responsibility. He turned back to me. Kell believed that because he never rang the bell, he could not be blamed for its sound. Mercer believed that because the bell itself caused no harm, he could not be blamed for what followed. Both were wrong. And you? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. I believe that once a man understands the likely consequence of his ideas, he assumes ownership of them, whether he wishes to or not. There was a finality in his tone that told me the subject was at rest in his mind. Later that night, as I prepared these concluding notes, I considered how best to end the account. Many readers, I knew, would look for a flourish, for some last dramatic stroke to seal the tale. But such endings would misrepresent the nature of this case, which resolved itself not with noise, but with comprehension. The little bell that tolled twice did not expose its secret through clever concealment or physical trickery. It succeeded and failed because it relied upon something far more fragile, the human tendency to mistake expectation for destiny. Holmes saw this at once, not because he feared such forces, but because he understood them. In the end, there was no single moment of revelation, no triumphant unmasking in a locked room. There was only a gradual narrowing of possibilities, until the truth stood alone, not dramatic, but undeniable. As for Holmes himself, he moved on as he always did. A new problem soon claimed his attention, and the bell passed from conversation into memory. Yet I observed that he listened more closely thereafter, not only for sounds that did not belong, but for ideas that asked to be accepted without examination. That, perhaps, was the final lesson of the case. The bell tolled twice, and in doing so revealed not merely a murderer, but a method of thinking that confuses certainty with virtue and influence with innocence. Holmes answered it once, and in answering, silenced it forever. The city sleeps tonight beneath honest bells and ordinary noises, untroubled by private summons or whispered threats. And if, now and then, a sound carries further meaning than expected, I take comfort in knowing that somewhere Holmes would be listening not to be alarmed, but to understand. That understanding, I am convinced, is the truest safeguard of all.